At the beginning, someone was thinking that in this world, there existed someone known as the Hero of Shadows. This individual would suddenly and swiftly appear in moments of crisis or on the battlefield, defeat enemies, save countless people, and then disappear. A beast was devouring human bodies, and a terrified girl stood nearby, frozen in fear as the monster approached her. Trembling, she muttered, "No," before screaming. At that moment, someone continued thinking that no one knew the Hero of Shadows' true identity. The only thing known for certain was that he dressed in all black and wore a plain mask. As the girl shut her eyes, a figure appeared in front of her, clad entirely in black. The Hero of Shadows devoured the beast into his shadow and said that the carnivorous beast should now sleep, as it had eaten enough. The girl stared at him, stunned. The Hero of Shadows looked at the fallen bodies and apologized for being late, adding that he would like to help with the mourning, but it seemed she would handle it faster than an amateur like him getting involved. While walking away, the Hero of Shadows said that he would bury the bodies and take care of the demonic beasts in the forest. He told her that once she was done mourning her guards, she should hurry back home. The girl sat there silently, tears welling up in her eyes, and thought in awe if this man was truly the Hero of Shadows. Crying, she whispered her gratitude, thanking him for saving her and calling him the Hero of Shadows. The Hero of Shadows thought to himself that he was indeed the Hero of Shadows. He saved people every day and disappeared without leaving a trace. His true identity would never be revealed. Then, the scene shifted to the streets of the Salmabart territory, in the southwest of the Lilac Kingdom. A poster fluttered through the air with the words, "The true identity of the Hero of Shadows has finally been revealed." People were shouting, extra edition," and gathered outside a mansion, yelling, "The Hero of Shadows! The Hero of Shadows!" Inside the mansion, Phil shouted in despair that his identity as the Hero of Shadows had been exposed. Slamming the table, he yelled, demanding to know how things had ended up like this. Phil Salmabart, eldest son of Count Salmabart, looked outside the window, where people were chanting his supposed title and begging him to wave his hand. Phil screamed for them to stop. From behind, a voice calmly remarked that he was loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. Phil turned to see Kahlua Scarlet, the maid who served him. Kahlua asked how many times this had happened today. Phil replied irritably that it was already the third time. While wiping the floor, Kahlua pointed out that by shouting like that, he was basically giving it away himself. Phil yelled that he was crying out loud because he had been found out. Kahlua casually wiped his face with the same cloth she had used on the floor. Phil protested in horror that she had just mopped with it, but she shrugged, saying it wasn't a big deal. She asked what was wrong with being found out. Phil shouted that it was a big deal because it was still only the first chapter. Kahlua frowned and said she didn't understand what he was talking about. She then asked why this had happened everywhere since that morning and if Phil had any idea. With a tense face, Phil hesitated before admitting there was a deep reason behind it. Kahlua told him not to look away. Phil sighed, then straightened with a proud expression and told her to listen. He remarked that he couldn't believe she could keep a straight face in such a ridiculous situation. Looking out the window, he saw people cheering, asking the Hero of Shadows to show his face and give them fan service. Phil explained that yesterday, he had helped someone, just like he always did. Kahlua commented that it was admirable. Phil continued, saying that the one he helped had been a super cute and well-dressed girl who had grabbed his hand and asked to thank him. Kahlua asked what happened next. Phil said that he had gotten excited, drunk too much, and ended up going to his usual brothel in the heat of the moment. Kahlua looked puzzled as he recalled what happened there. At the brothel, one of the girls had asked him if he had any heroic tales to tell. Phil had drunkenly shouted that he, Phil Salmabart, was actually the Hero of Shadows, though he added, "Just kidding," right after. The girls had squealed in amazement. Back in the present, Phil admitted that he must have blurted something like that out. Kahlua scolded him, calling it an unpleasant reason, and said that if his characteristics hadn't matched, people would have just thought he was lying. She demanded to know why he had said his real name while wearing the black outfit and mask. Phil shook in panic, shouting that alcohol was scary. Kahlua sighed, saying she felt sorry for his head. Phil complained that he still didn't understand why everyone believed it so easily. He said that if people had heard about his bad reputation, they'd be suspicious. After all, he spent his days and nights at brothels, indulging in depravity. He called himself the good-for-nothing son of a count. Kahlua sarcastically remarked that he sounded proud of it. Phil continued, saying that he wasn't popular with anyone, not even the servants, so why would anyone mistake him for the Hero of Shadows based on one drunken remark? Kahlua suddenly remembered that she had left his black outfit and mask hanging outside to dry since yesterday. Phil screamed in horror, demanding to know what she had done. Outside, a child pointed at the clothes, shouting that it was the Hero of Shadows outfit. Kahlua admitted the garments were covered in vomit and said it was his fault for drinking too much. Phil yelled that she was hanging the evidence for everyone to see and pushing his misfortune even further. Kahlua sighed and said she hadn't thought it would turn out like this, adding that since he had thrown up and blurted out his secret, it couldn't be helped. Phil cried out dramatically that a heroine shouldn't blarg like that and that he was cornered from all sides. Kahlua calmly said it was his fifth scream already and asked why he wanted to hide it so much in the first place, since he hadn't done anything wrong. Phil shouted that he wanted to enjoy a carefree life without being tied down. With a serious face, he declared that he wanted to go to brothels in the morning, brothels at noon, and brothels at night. Kahlua pointed out that he was basically living there at that point. Phil grabbed her shoulders and said that if his identity got exposed, they would slap him with a half-baked medal and turn him into a political tool. Kahlua thought that she felt like she was being lectured. Phil continued, saying that people in power always surrounded themselves with skilled individuals and used them at will. He asked who would willingly become a masochistic carriage horse. Kahlua dryly remarked that being an M suited him. Phil shouted that it didn't. Phil went on, saying that it was cool when a hero walked away silently without saying anything. He added that just the other day, he had even said something like, "It's not worth mentioning," and tried to leave, but Kahlua interrupted to remind him that he had blurted out his name immediately after. Phil groaned, saying he wanted to crawl into a hole. Kahlua sighed, telling him that if he hated it that much, he should just stay quietly at home instead of helping people. Phil frowned and told her not to be stupid. He said there was no way he could ignore someone in trouble. With a serious look, he said that was just who he was. Kahlua looked at him, blushing slightly, and said that he should decide whether he was a nice guy or a fool. Phil noticed her blush and asked what was wrong, but she quickly said it was nothing. Phil then shouted that he had never wanted anyone to find out. He just wanted to live a carefree, debauched life without becoming a pawn in noble or royal schemes. Kahlua then mentioned that a letter had come from the royal family. Phil froze and screamed that he couldn't take it anymore. Kahlua told him to calm down, saying breakfast was ready and he could read it while eating. Outside, the crowd was still cheering. Later, in the dining room, Phil sat down and muttered a weary thanks for the meal. Kahlua observed that he had eaten everything but looked drained. Phil said that nothing could be more depressing than eating breakfast after one's identity had been exposed. Kahlua told him not to throw up again and asked if he had read the letter. Phil acted surprised and asked if such a thing existed. Kahlua dryly replied that its existence had been erased. Phil opened the window and said that the people should have disbanded by now, but as soon as he looked out, the crowd erupted again, shouting, "The Hero of Shadows has appeared. Kia, Shadow-sama. Please, give us a smile." Phil closed the window immediately and said that he would shut himself in. Kahlua sighed and told him that nothing had changed, suggesting he wave proudly since the crowd was harmless. Phil shouted if she was suggesting he parade around, waving with a grin wherever he went, asking who would want to see someone heading to a brothel with an entourage. Kahlua told him to stop going to brothels, and Phil screamed that there was no way he would. Kahlua asked if it was really enough to make him cry. Suddenly, the room shook. Phil paused and wondered about the sound and the shaking. The door burst open, and his younger brother Zan entered. Zan sneered that he had thought he smelt garbage coming from this room, but that it turned out to be his dear brother. Phil shouted that he had thought he heard a pig squealing but realized it was Zan. He called his brother a fatty and asked if he was the reason the mansion was shaking. Kahlua warned them not to make things complicated. Zan yelled in rage, and Phil demanded to know why he was there when he was usually out playing and never came home. Zan said he had come to talk about the commotion outside. Pointing at Phil, he shouted that his good-for-nothing, playboy brother being the Hero of Shadows, was a joke and that he wished Phil would stop with his big talk. Phil smirked and asked if Zan was saying the people's excitement outside was all a lie. Zan shouted that of course it was and said that Phil had no talent, couldn't work, and lacked any martial skills, so why would anyone think there was anything heroic about him? Phil's face tensed as he thought that Zan knew him well. He admitted internally that Zan was right, he wasn't the Hero of Shadows. Kahlua asked why he sounded delighted about it. Phil said, "Good job," and added that scum could see through other scum. Kahlua sighed that she felt sorry for their parents. Zan then turned to Kahlua and told her to hurry up and become his. Kahlua exclaimed in shock that now the spear was pointed at her too and said that wasn't going to happen. Zan told her to watch her tone, reminding her that she was just a lowly maid. Kahlua replied that she had already decided who she would respect and serve. Grabbing Phil, she said that he was her only master. With a serious face, she reminded Zan that she was technically a guest. Zan shouted for her to shut up and said that even so, she was still a maid, asking what she thought and insisting he was better than Phil. Kahlua's expression turned angry, and as Zan tried to continue, she kicked him in the face, sending him flying. Phil accidentally saw her underwear and muttered, "Ah, pink," earning a kick to his own face as well. Both brothers rolled on the floor. Kahlua then told the maids that Zan didn't seem to be feeling well and asked them to take him away. The maids, terrified, quickly carried Zan out, apologizing as they fled. Phil groaned that he wasn't feeling well either, but Kahlua snapped that it wasn't the time for that. She then told him that a guest would be arriving that afternoon to see him. Phil groaned that it was just one thing after another and that she should have told him in advance. Kahlua replied that she had been swamped by all the letters pouring in after the rumors spread. Phil asked who the guest was, and Kahlua said it was the Saintess. Phil froze in shock and repeated the word Saintess. He thought about the Saintess, a figure blessed by the goddess of the globally worshipped Allisto faith, who brought happiness to the people and protected them from calamities. Recent examples included her role in defeating the Demon King and saving people from a plague. Because of these deeds, her support had grown immensely, and she now held such influence that it could not be ignored on a national scale. Soon after, a girl introduced herself as Millis and apologized for her sudden visit. Phil thought that there were currently 4 saintesses and that this girl was one of them. Since he wasn't a follower of the Allisto faith, he only saw her as an unusual guest. He welcomed her politely and thought that she seemed strangely familiar. Millis smiled and thanked him warmly. When they were seated, Phil asked what purpose the Saintess had in visiting. Millis blushed and said she had really wanted to meet Phil Sama. Phil, overwhelmed, thought that she was difficult to talk to, and that it would be easier to talk to a macho man than to someone like her. He knew he had to be cautious since her influence was so strong. Millis asked if it was all right for her to address him as the Hero of Shadows. Phil's face tensed as he whispered to Kahlua, saying that she already knew the reason for this visit. Kahlua whispered back that no matter how they looked at it, Millis had come because of the Hero of Shadows. Phil whispered that if her goal was the Hero of Shadows, he would just tell her he was trash and send her away quickly. Kahlua warned that if he messed up, their parents could get into trouble. Millis then said she had come to express her gratitude. Phil whispered jokingly to Kahlua that if Millis wanted to show gratitude, a strip show would be a win-win. Kahlua replied dryly that only one side would be winning. Phil insisted that gratitude should be shown by giving the other person what they wanted, and in his case, he wanted to see them naked. Kahlua muttered that he truly thought like an enemy of women. Phil decided to play dumb and spoke with a bright smile, pretending to be shocked at the idea that he was the Hero of Shadows. He told Millis she must be joking and that she must have heard the rumors about him. Millis smiled and told him to call her Millis. Phil nervously repeated her name and said she must have heard the gossip about him. Millis cheerfully said she had heard that he was a spoilt brat, a good-for-nothing, and an arigappa. Phil winced and said that since she knew that, then Millis interrupted, saying there must be reasons behind all that, right? Blushing, she looked at him expectantly. Phil whispered to Kahlua that he couldn't take this girl anymore. Kahlua replied that Millis was quite a formidable saintess and asked if he remembered helping her. Phil thought for a moment and said he thought he had helped a girl dressed like that about a month ago. Kahlua whispered that between yesterday's confession and this, there was probably no one who embodied what goes around comes around better. Phil muttered that someday this might end up as educational material about dark history. Phil then thought about what to do. He needed to make her leave without being rude. He addressed Millis again and said that while there were rumors about him being the Hero of Shadows, it was a mistake. Smiling, he explained that he was merely a fan of the Hero of Shadows and that it was unthinkable for trash like him to be mistaken for the real one. He added that there was no resemblance, and since Millis had actually been saved, she should know that. Millis insisted that there were resemblances. Phil, stunned, asked with a tense smile what exactly she thought it resembled. Millis said happily that their heights were the same. Phil replied that plenty of people were around his height. Millis then said that their voices resembled each other too. Phil stammered that voices could easily sound similar. Millis added that even their scents resembled each other, causing Phil to shout in disbelief, asking if she was some kind of new stalker. Phil turned to Kahlua and asked if they could still politely ask Millis to leave. Then, panicking, He shouted that he couldn't fake his way out of this anymore and told Kahlua not to hold him down. Kahlua restrained him, saying it was for his own good. Melis, with conviction, declared that Phil was undoubtedly the hero of shadows and that she had realized it the moment they met. Phil tried to speak, but Melis continued, saying that she had come all this way to express her gratitude for what happened back then. She admitted that she had been worried about getting permission from the Archbishop, but surprisingly, it had gone smoothly. Phil thought about the Archbishop while Melis, blushing and nervous, said that when it came to actually expressing her gratitude, she couldn't help but feel shy. Phil blushed as well, thinking that if not for the Hero of Shadows mess, he would have seriously gone after her. He then noticed movement behind the window and wondered if it was the power of the Saintess. Suddenly, the glass cracked, and two assassins burst in through the window. Kahlua immediately rushed to Melis and pulled her away, while Phil kicked the table toward the attackers. One assassin charged through it, and Phil caught his hand between the table, slamming him down. The second assassin looked around, and Phil appeared above him, saying that the element of surprise was supposed to be the attacker's speciality. Grabbing the man's head, Phil slammed it into the floor and shouted, "Binding magic," followed by incarceration. The bodies were absorbed into shadows. The knights, Kahlua, and Melis all stood frozen with tense faces. Melis then looked at Phil and, trembling, said that she knew it he truly was the hero of shadows. Phil's expression stiffened, and he thought in despair that he had completely messed up. The scene shifted again to a palace where three figures in black clothing stood. One of them angrily said that the mission had failed, expressing disbelief that all those skilled men hadn't returned. A woman with a large hammer smirked and muttered, "The hero of shadows, huh?" Then, the scene shifts, and Phil thought that one of the essential elements in magic was the concept of carved names. Phil reflected that magic was activated by imprinting an ideal onto a spell, and that for that purpose, carved names were used. Phil reasoned that there were as many spells as there were ideals held by mages and therefore an infinite number of carved names. Phil considered that his magic consisted of submerging the target into a woven space and restricting their movements. The carved name for it, he thought, was the freedom of not being tied to anyone. Phil then realized he was bound by a rope, unable to move on the bed, and shouted that he was completely bound and not free at all. Phil wondered what was going on, asking if he had developed a new fetish in his sleep or if he had been caught up in some serious incident. Kahlua entered and greeted him with "Good morning," noting that he was finally awake. Phil announced that he had already figured out who the culprit was, but Kahlua said she would have liked to enjoy the mystery a little longer. Kahlua explained that there was no choice. They had a case they could not ignore. When Kahlua asked Phil what his plans were for the day, Phil admitted that after breakfast he had been thinking of going to the brothel. Kahlua said that, given that, tying him up had been the right decision. Phil protested, and Kahlua scolded him for thinking of going to the brothel and leaving the saint unattended. Phil clarified that Melis Sama had to stay overnight to be protected from the attackers and that he had used magic in front of the saint, to which Kahlua replied made it impossible to hide now. Phil grinned awkwardly as Melis and some guards began remarking that, after all, he was the legendary Shadow Hero. The guards agreed that after witnessing his power, there was no denying it. Another guard declared that he was the real one. Melis noted that Phil stubbornly kept denying it. The guards mentioned that in the city people even called Phil useless or a worthless son. Melis, blushing, insisted that regardless of what others said, Phil Sama was a wonderful person and that she had felt his genuine kindness. Melis asserted that there must be a reason behind all of this. The scene shifted back to Phil, still tied up, who sneezed and heard Kahlua remark on the disgusting sneeze. Phil groaned that this was the worst while lying on the bed bound. Kahlua observed that aside from his identity being exposed, as long as Melis Sama remained with them, she would be safe. Phil protested, and Kahlua asked what he thought about yesterday's attack. Phil suggested it was probably a faction dispute. Kahlua questioned that, and Phil explained that the church had no pope at present, the previous one having passed away without a successor. Two archbishops were competing for the position, one, an elderly man with a long career, the other a young woman of mysterious identity. Phil noted that there were also two saintesses whose authority, followers, and sponsors were evenly balanced, and that the faction struggle between the two archbishops had reached a stalemate. Kahlua wondered aloud whether they would really send a valuable saint because of a simple rumor, and Phil said the archbishops wanted to establish a relationship with the Shadow Hero so they could publicly claim that the Shadow Hero had joined their faction. Kahlua felt Melis Sama had come sincerely to express gratitude, and Phil agreed that this was likely. adding that the archbishop had probably exploited the saint's gesture for his own gain. Phil observed that since the archbishops competed for popularity and contributions, bloody stories rarely surfaced publicly. Kahlua asked if it was possible the attackers had been sent by the rival faction, and Phil agreed that it was likely. If even one saint disappeared, the power balance would tip drastically, so bringing a saint down would be a clear objective. Phil noted that it would have been easier to interpret if the attackers had not poisoned themselves. Phil then feigned, crying that he was caught up in this hassle, but he quickly became serious and promised that as long as the saint stayed there, they would take care of her. After reaching that agreement, Phil asked Kahlua to remove the rope. Phil complained that if this continued, he would not even be able to visit the brothel, let alone pick flowers, and joked that he felt as if he had traveled back to his childhood. Kahlua teased that Phil must have been very cute back then and asked him to show that side now. Phil panicked, insisting Kahlua had not even been there back then, and threatened to make history on the sheets if this went on. Kahlua reacted with a laugh and a playfully scolding, "Ah," as Phil sat up and begged to be released. Kahlua accused him of planning to go to the brothel, to which Phil muttered that the sheets would turn black. Millis then entered, cheerfully thanking Phil for the previous day. Millis noticed Kahlua holding Phil with a rope and apologized for the trouble before Kahlua quipped that she liked this kind of game and called Phil "my mistress" sarcastically. Phil scolded Kahlua not to dishonor his mistress and called her a damn maid. Outside, people called for more of the Shadow Hero's manju and begged for autographs. Phil, writing in a room, sighed that nothing good had happened since yesterday. Kahlua reminded him at least that he had cleared up the misunderstanding with Millis-sama, which Phil grudgingly accepted as something positive. Phil then turned to work, reading a paper and wondering about worsening security, what the guards were doing, and whether a staff shortage was so bad despite decent finances. Phil speculated whether residents of his territory were rebellious teenagers. Kahlua explained that precisely because the economy was good, more people were coming, and troublemaking teens were not surprising. Phil resolved to increase the number of guards to put those kids in their place. Someone in the room volunteered to recruit people on the remaining budget, and another urged Phil to speak up, joking that if Phil sighed, happiness would escape. Phil looked out the window and observed that everyone seemed harmonious and security did not appear too bad, while Kahlua grumbled about when security would return. Millis sat on Phil's lap, feeding him, insisting she wanted to thank him properly and that she planned to stay a long time. Millis cheerfully said she had been saved twice, and therefore felt compelled to express gratitude. She wanted to do something to make Phil-sama happy. Kahlua playfully pinched Phil's cheek and teased that he complained a lot but melted for Millis simply because she was cute. Phil insisted it was all part of a plan, befriend Millis and have her spread the word that Phil-sama was not the shadow hero. Phil admitted he hoped that if Millis-sama could be fooled no longer, he could use her influence to fool the others. Kahlua praised his refusal to walk away empty-handed after a failure. Phil fretted that the situation might not die down since more people were present than the previous day and whispered to Kahlua that the rumor about him being the shadow hero persisted. Kahlua explained that the saint's visit made the rumor far more believable. The saintess, who never planned a pilgrimage, had suddenly come to see Phil-sama, and that alone had lent credence to the gossip. Phil cursed that the moment she visited, it had all been over. Millis asked what he meant by over, and Kahlua revealed that someone was spreading the rumor across the city. Phil asked Millis about her escort nights, and Millis replied that to spread the faith of Aristism, they had been interacting with villagers. Phil accused them of neglecting duties after the attack, and Millis speculated that the knights had assumed the saint would be safe with the shadow hero. Phil shouted that he could not keep using Millis-sama as an excuse. Millis tentatively asked whether Phil did not want others to know he was the shadow hero. Phil admitted that was basically the case and thought his face might already give the answer. Millis was sad and worried that she might have been a burden, but Phil reassured her that he could see she meant no harm and could not blame someone like her. Millis smiled and thanked him, calling him very kind. Kahlua cautioned Phil that this might not be the time to lock himself away and asked what he planned to do about the royal family's letter. Millis reacted in surprise at a letter from the castle. Kahlua confirmed the letter had arrived yesterday. Phil declared he would ignore it. Millis warned that ignoring the royal family could be dangerous, but Phil speculated the letter would order him to appear at court and insisted he would refuse to become a political tool, claiming he could say he was busy attending to the saint. Millis asked if he was sure and suggested it could be an important royal matter. Phil smiled and said Millis-sama was more important to him at the moment, thinking what a hassle the royal summons would be. Outside, villagers shouted for the shadow hero to show his face, and Phil begged them to be quiet. The scene later showed night, with Phil and Kahlua discussing recent attacks on nobles in Count Amethyst's territory. Phil decided he would handle it. Kahlua cautioned that if Phil did not want people to know he was the shadow hero, perhaps he should not go. But Phil rejected that suggestion. He could not ignore someone else's misfortune. Kahlua conceded the idea had been silly and admitted that she had been helped by Phil's kindness in the past. Phil hinted at something left behind for him, but when asked by Kahlua, he brushed it off and said it was nothing. Instead, he saw the opportunity to clear up rumors. Phil proposed that after rescuing people, he would introduce himself with a fake name so that if the shadow hero claimed not to be Phil, the rumor that Phil Salmabart was the shadow hero would disappear. Kahlua was impressed, and Phil cheekily asked if, having impressed her, he could return to the brothel. Kahlua denied the request. They shared a smile. Kahlua told him to take care, and Phil waved and disappeared into the night. The scene shifted to Phil traveling on the road to Amethyst territory, shown on a mountain under the moon. A villager thanked the shadow hero for coming, but Phil downplayed the reverence and asked the villager to lift his head, insisting he did not like to be treated with such adulation. The villager explained that failing to honor the shadow hero who had saved them would be unthinkable and pleaded that they be allowed to address Phil that way. Phil noted that he could only arrive quickly because scouts in the region had informed him of the trouble and urged setting aside the formalities. Phil soon spotted people under attack and headed toward them, telling the villager to stay safe. Phil prepared for another day of helping people. He saw bandits fighting knights, and one knight ordered others to protect the carriage and the young lady inside. A girl emerged from the carriage declaring she would fight too, but the knight urged her to return to safety. A bandit charged the knight with the intention to kill, and the girl closed her eyes, thinking someone would save them. A scream rang out, and the girl opened her eyes to see Phil standing atop the bandit. Phil admonished the attackers not to get so excited about killing a girl, and declared that questions could wait because it was not the time for interrogation. The girl recognized the black clothes and plain mask and wondered if Phil might be the shadow hero. Phil proclaimed that the freedom to attack others would be taken from those who trampled on others' happiness. Phil declared he would impose fitting restraints and welcome them to a world with restrictions. Snapping his fingers, Phil unleashed a black wave that swallowed the bandits. Phil thought of a vast ocean inviting them into a world of restraint, the sea of shadow that consumed the bandits. When the dust settled, the carriage and knights remained alive, and Phil remarked that this looked like the last of the trouble. The knight thanked Phil, and Phil waved off the gratitude. The girl introduced herself as Alicia Amethysta, the only daughter of the Amethysta Count family, and thanked Phil on behalf of everyone. Phil said he had not acted for gratitude but then loudly announced his fake name, shouting that his name was Phi. All the knights and Alicia were stunned. Alicia repeated, "Phi-san?" with a tense expression. Phil claimed that lately imposters had been pretending to be the shadow hero and that the real Fae was the genuine article, asking that if they liked him, they should at least remember his name. As the carriage moved away, Alicia called out her thanks, and a knight commented that Phil had been a strange but good young man. Another knight remarked that now they knew who the shadow hero was. Alicia looked after Phil with a thoughtful expression. The scene then shifted to a mansion where Millis was bathing and remarking on how clean and pleasant the bathroom was. Kahlua apologized for inviting Millis so suddenly, and Millis replied that she was happy to have come unexpectedly just to chat. Kahlua had thought it a good way to pass the time until Phil returned. Millis confessed she envied Kahlua's mature appearance and admitted she wanted to look more grown-up like Kira Ani-chan, whom she affectionately called someone who had always taken care of her and understood her. Kahlua praised Millis, saying she was already very attractive, and Millis smiled shyly while declaring her goal to become an adult woman like Kira Oni-chan and that she would eat a lot of food to grow up. Later, with the bandits incapacitated on the ground, Phil considered handing them over to the officials before he heard footsteps and turned to see a girl carrying a hammer. Phil observed that the girl's habit resembled Millis Sama's and mused that she was not normal. The girl teased that since Phil had helped someone again that night, perhaps she should be escorted back. She joked about a night date, then playfully accused Phil of being unfaithful and asked whether he had girls at home like the saint. Phil wondered how much she knew and then watched as the girl smashed bandits' heads with her hammer, splattering blood everywhere. She announced she had successfully defeated the villains again and walked away humming that when she returned, a bath and sweets would be waiting. The girl told Phil that helping people was fine but added seriously that true salvation only came when one killed the villains. Phil listened with a tense face.
By the way, if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider liking and subscribing, pretty please?